So in my previous videos, we have looked quite a lot at bop scales or bebop scales, and I think those are great, but we mostly use them over standard type tunes, older tunes, or preferably bop tunes, hence the name bop scales, right? But you can also use bop scales in a different way over more modern tunes. And with modern, I mean like modal, I guess, more modal tunes or non-functional harmony tunes. So we're going to take a look at the tune 500 Miles High by Chick Corea and see if we can apply bop scales to that. So let's get right into it. Alright, so bop scales and superimposed bop scales. So this is kind of an extension on my previous videos on bop scales. So if you don't know what bop scales are, you should probably watch those first or any other video explaining what bop scales are. This is for you who are kind of looking for the next thing that you can do with these scales. Let me just repeat real quick what bop scales are and why we use them. So a bop scale is essentially a diatonic scale with one added chromatic note, which gives us an 8-note scale, and that gives us a chord on every other note, a chord and a passing note. So if I take C major, let's take B flat major because we're gonna use that chord in this tune. So B flat major, B flat, and then I add a flat 6. Which gives you a chord tone, passing note, chord tone, passing note, passing note, chord tone, passing note, chord tone. And there's a little bit of confusion here, something we need to understand, and that is that when we talk about major chords, we're talking about major 6 chords. I don't know when that changed, because in early jazz you play 6 chords, not major 7ths. So there's some confusion there, because some real books say, for example, you play All of Me, that it's a C major 7 chord, but that chord sounds pretty bad if you're playing a C major triad in the melody, right? So a major 6 chord works better. So just to try to explain what that is all about. And when you're using bop scales, you can hear the chord, right? That's a B flat major 6 chord. So because of that, I can pretty much play a jazz standard using bop scales, and hopefully you can hear what standard I'm playing. So for example, I don't know, and so on. So that was obviously all the things you are. Now, that works because we're outlining the harmony. So those are kind of 4-part chords moving, and we're playing all the important notes on strong beats. That's why we can hear the harmony. But if you play a tune like 500 Miles High, a more modern tune, and with modern I mean like, you know, what is it, 70s Chick Corea released this song. They're not. What I mean by that, it's not a functional harmony tune in the same way that All the Things You Are is. We treat each chord as a mode, kind of, even though you can still think of it as some kind of, some chords have functions and so on, but it's completely different, right? And we don't want to outline the 4-part chords. We want to outline the upper structures of the chords, because that's where the extensions are, right? So, for example, the first chord is an E minor. And obviously, when you see the chord symbol E minor or E minor 7 in a jazz context, it doesn't mean that you should play exactly E minor 7. It means that you can take any note from that sound or that scale, that mode, and create a voicing that fits the song and the situation and all that. So you could play an E minor 9, E minor 11, or E minor 13, even though you have to be a little bit careful with the 13 there. But the extensions are the important notes. And oftentimes those are the notes in the melody. In, for example, a Wayne Shorter tune, you often find the extensions in the melody as opposed to a tune like All the Things You Are, where there are chord tones in the melody. The melody consists of chord tones. So it's very important to understand that difference. That means that these bop scales are not really going to work over a tune like 500 Miles High. Instead, we're going to use upper structure bop scales or superimposed bop scales. I don't know what to call it. I guess upper structure bop scales work. So let me explain what that is. For example, if we take B flat major 7, I'm just gonna make a little loop with a B flat major 7, and I'm gonna leave the chord open so that I don't give away all the extensions. I'm just gonna play a root and the 7th and the 3rd. So this tune is kind of a Latin jazz tune, so we're gonna play some kind of Latin vamp here, okay? So here's a B flat major 7. And the bop scale we normally play would be this, right? But as I said, that scale gives us a B flat 6 sound. We are looking for a more B flat major 9 perhaps, or sharp 11 kind of sound. So we need to look at the upper structures of that chord. The first upper structure is D minor 7. You can totally play a D minor 7 as a chord over this chord, right? You've probably played that chord, right? B flat major 9. That means that we can play that scale too. So that would be a D Phrygian bop scale. So a Phrygian scale with an added major 7. And now all of a sudden, instead of creating the sound of a B flat 6 chord, we're creating a 3rd, 5th, major 7, and the 9th. Which is more modern sounding. But in this tune, we want to treat the B flat major 7 as a Lydian chord because of the context. So we just change the E flat to an E natural, and we get a D Aeolian bop scale, which I think is even more hip sounding. So what am I doing? There it is. Okay, and then we can move to the next up structure, which would be F major 7. The thing here, though, is that the F major bop scale is the same thing as what we just played, right? So it's redundant. Next upper structure would be A minor 7. So then we can play A Phrygian bop scale, meaning adding a major 7. Which gives us the the 7th, 9th, sharp 11, and the 13th. Then you can play, and this is my favorite, and the one we're gonna use for 500 Miles High, is to play a C mixo bop scale. Right? Really cool sound over that chord. You can go even further if you want and play, if you want to create a major 7 sharp 5 sound and play a D mixolydian flat 6 bop scale. Then you're creating a sharp 5 sound. Remember, I didn't play a 5th in the voicing, so it's not going to clash. Takes a little bit of getting used to, and don't try it on every gig, but I think it's worth trying. So where am I getting all this stuff from? Yet again, I'm using a Jerry Bergonzi book that I've covered in the past, Jazz Line, where he goes through every bop scale imaginable, and it's one of the last chapters in the book where he calls that scale on scale, and he just lists every possible bop scale that you can play over a C major chord. Then he does the same thing over other chord structures or chord types. It gets a little bit tricky when you get to the altered dominance or dominance in general. Everything gets a little bit trickier, so I'm not gonna go over everything here because that would be another video. Plus, I don't want to give away everything that is in this book because I didn't come up with this stuff. Jerry Bergonzi came up with this stuff, right? But I can tell you that for dominant chords, there are no less than 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, at least 12 different bop scales that he suggests that you can try over dominant chords. So for those of you who feel like you are bored with your current practicing material and you need a lifetime of more stuff to work on, and you don't have this book, so now that we know how we can superimpose bop scales over major 7 chords, we need to figure out how to do the same thing over the other chord types in 500 Miles High. So let's just take a look at the tune and see what scales. First we need to know the regular scales that we are going to use. And I've picked a few scales that I like and I think fit. You might disagree, you might think that there are other scales that work better. So it's not set in stone, but these are the scales that I like. So for the first chord, E Dorian, and then G Dorian for the G minor, B flat Lydian, and for the B minor 7 flat 5, we're gonna play Locrian natural 2, or maybe it's easier to think of it as a D melodic minor scale. And E altered for the altered chord. Dorian for the F minor, no sorry, we were A minor, so Dorian for A minor, then Locrian natural 2 again, which happens to be A melodic minor, and then Dorian for F minor and Dorian for C minor and altered for B. So basically any chord, any minor chord, we're playing Dorian, the major chord, I think it's only one major chord, we're playing a Lydian scale, And for the minor 7 flat 5 chords, we're playing a low Korean natural 2 scale. And for the altered chords, we're playing the altered scale. So before you start doing this exercise, if you haven't played this tune in a while or you're a little bit unsure of those scales, you might want to practice just playing the regular scales, right? So I'm just going to make a little bit a slow backing track of the chords with my loop pedal. So maybe just play scales. So I'm guessing that most of you watching this are not too uncomfortable doing that. You know these scales, right? But if you're a little bit unsure, before you dive into the superimposed Bebop scales, you might want to just make sure that you know these scales in and out. You know, all the positions and all that kind of stuff. So what are the Bebop scales we're gonna use? So there, as you saw earlier, you can create many different types of superimposed Bebop scales. So I'm just going to pick one that I like the most and I think works the best for the purpose of this video. So for the minor chords, we're going to go up a fifth and play a minor Bebop scale. So for the E minor, I'm going to play B minor, which gives us the 5th, 3rd, 9th, and the 11th. 5th, 3rd, 9th. So I think that works really well. And so for D minor, we're gonna play, for G minor, we're gonna play D minor. So Aeolian Bebop scale. Up a 5th. And for the B flat major 7, we're gonna play a C mixo Bebop scale. And then for the B minor 7 flat 5, we're gonna play a D melodic minor Bebop scale. And then for the altered chords, there's so many options, but I like this one. I play an altered scale and just add a regular 5th. So that would be a C mixo flat 6. Right? And then what's the next chord? A minor, we're gonna play E, Aeolian Bebop scale. F sharp minor 7 flat 5, we're going to play an A melodic minor Bebop scale. And then F minor is going to be C Aeolian Bebop scale, and the C minor is going to be a G Aeolian Bebop scale, and finally B altered is going to be again an altered scale with a regular 5th, which would be G mixo flat 6. So the problem with this is like the names get really long, right, for these scales, so it's easy to get confused. But it's not that strange when you get used to them. It's not that out there as you might think. So what I'm going to do now is going to play each of these scales from the lowest note, so from the actually transposed scale, right? So you should see what that sounds like. So first here we have a B Aeolian bop scale coming up over the E minor 7, right? D minor, C, so I had to play the minor 2/5 there twice as fast because of the how the chords are moving. So it sounds pretty straightforward when you hear it like that, right? Even though it might seem like a really strange theory concept, it's not that strange sounding. Then when you can do that, the next step is to start of the next note of that scale. So we started on the root. So the root of the transposed scale, not the root of the chord. This is a little bit confusing now, but we're thinking B minor over E minor. So the next note would be D, which is the third of that B minor, right? But it's also the flat 7 of the E minor. So there's a little bit of a, you have to think kind of two ways, which is, it's a good exercise. So then you start on the next note of that, which would be F sharp. And then finally you start on the last note, which would be the A. So it's important that you can start on any note so that when you, because the goal is to be able to connect these, right? That's why you need to be able to start on any note. But I don't have time to go over all that right now, so we're just gonna move on. Because, okay, so let's say you know your scales, and you know these chords and how to play the scales, and now you learn these bop scales, and that's all good, but you're still having trouble playing on this tune. And I think the trickiest part about all of this is not playing the scales over the right chord and all that. It is to connect the lines you're playing over the chord change, especially when the chord change is strange, when it's not a diatonic chord change. So for example, E minor to G minor is a weird chord change. You don't hear that in pop music, unless it's the Doors maybe or something. But I mean, you can hear that kind of chords change in pop music, but it's rare, and you're not supposed to solo over it, right? So we need to be able to connect our lines. And if I ask you right now to connect all these scales in the best possible way, the closest way for each chord change, that might be too big of an assignment, right? So what I recommend doing is taking each chord change at a time. So let's start with E minor to G minor. And then you try to connect the bop scales as best you can. Okay, and when I do this, I'm not trying to be super dogmatic and super correct. If I mess up a little bit here and there, the goal is not to be perfect. The goal is to kind of get used to that chord change and to connect your lines. And slowly but gradually, hopefully you'll start to notice that what's happens after a while is that you start thinking ahead. You're thinking about the next chord, and this needs to happen. So when you're playing your stuff on the E minor, you're kind of already in the next chord. Especially, you can hear that where your idea is going or where it wants to go. And I think that's the difference between a really great and experienced jazz player and somebody who's maybe a little bit more beginner, is that they are more able to do that. Their ideas have a direction because they know exactly where they're going with their phrases and melodic ideas and motifs and lines and all the rest of it. So this kind of practicing will help you do that. Then you take the next chord change, and then the next, and then maybe some chord changes are more difficult for you. You want to spend more time with that. And then you can also find that after a while, some chord changes are not that hard because they share a lot of common notes. For example, A minor to F sharp minor 755 is very similar. So that you can use. The F sharp minor to F minor is a little bit weird, right? Even though you see that chord change even in regular jazz as well, it's still kind of something you need to spend some time with. So let me just reiterate my point that when you're playing bop scales is usually something you play to outline the chords of a jazz standard, a regular jazz tune or a bop tune with functional harmony in it. Whereas when you play over 500 miles high, bop scales is not the first thing that I would recommend. Somebody who's trying to improvise over that, I would recommend just playing the modes, pentatonics, and all that kind of stuff, right? However, you can still use bop scales to create these kind of sounds. For example, when I hear Pat Metheny play, I transcribed some of his solos, and it sounds like he's playing a bop scale. But when you transcribe it, you notice it's not a regular bop scale. It's just something else. And it might be that he's just kind of adding chromaticism randomly, or maybe he's doing this kind of things. I don't know. You would have to ask him. All right, so that was my lesson on superimposed bop scales on 500 miles high. As always, I'll try to put my PDFs with these scales written out on my Patreon page for my Patreons. And if you want to join me there, I would be most grateful. That will help me to produce these videos because they're obviously time consuming and all that. So again, thanks for watching. I shall see you next time.